New York at night was always impossibly beautiful. The skyscrapers glowed like the pulsing veins of a sleepless giant. From the 47th floor of Bellamy Tower, Gary Bellamy looked down at that city every night and felt nothing. The brighter the lights below, the emptier he felt inside. His penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, Italian marble floors, minimalist design, and everything priced 100 times beyond necessity. Yet in that multi-million-dollar space, he truly wanted nothing, no trace of a human heartbeat. The faint clink of a glass on stone echoed like metal against a cold wall. Gary poured himself a rare whiskey, a taste that had long since gone dull. Success had come to him too early, too easily. At 35, Gary was the poster child of a new generation of CEOs, creative, sharp, a man who ruled everything through numbers, charts, and data. He owned Bellamy Systems, a software empire spanned 3 continents, employed tens of thousands, and surpassed Wall Street's projections quarter after quarter. The world admired him. Only he no longer believed in his own worth. In the silence of his apartment, so still he could hear his heartbeat, Gary unlocked his phone. A new message from his mother appeared, brief and commanding. "Gary, meet the Campbell girl again. She's perfect for you. And remember, the board won't wait forever." Gary pressed his lips together. He had heard the same line for 3 years straight. The Campbell girl has a flawless background, a prestigious education, a father who is a pharmaceutical magnate, and a mother who is a celebrated businesswoman, a perfect match to strengthen the Bellamy empire. But to Gary, it was just another merger, soulless, loveless. He recalled his father's words before he died. "Bellamys don't cry. Bellamys control their emotions. Feelings make people weak." Perhaps that was when young Gary began transforming into a perfect money-making machine and forgot how to feel. Tonight, the silence in his penthouse pressed heavily on his shoulders. He turned off the lights and stood before the window, watching the city fade under a thin veil of mist. A part of him wanted to run away from numbers, contracts, and cold handshakes. Without thinking, Gary put on his coat and walked out. He wanted to walk for the first time in months, to feel something real. The elevator descended in quiet hums, numbers counting backward: 40, 7, 30, 8, 25, 10, 1. When the doors opened, cold wind slapped his face, filled with the scent of the streets, smoke, dampness, the scent of life itself. Gary inhaled deeply. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew his feet needed to get as far away from that tower as possible. Late-night New York was a different body altogether, no longer dazzling or pretending. Neighborhoods that gleamed by day now lay dim and muted, lit only by a few yellowed lamps. Gary walked through damp alleys, past shuttered shops, across a bridge toward Brooklyn Heights. His assistant had once warned him, "That area isn't safe, especially after midnight." But he wasn't afraid. Perhaps when one has lost all feeling, fear disappears too. The click of his expensive leather shoes against cracked concrete sounded strangely out of place, metal in the wilderness. Then another sound emerged, soft, warm, unfamiliar. A voice singing. At first, it was only scattered notes, then gradually a clear melody, gentle as breath. Not a famous song, not one sang for money. It was a lullaby, simple, honest, carrying pain in every word. Gary stopped. That voice felt like an invisible hand touching something profound inside him, something he thought had long since died. He followed the sound through a narrow alley, under a dim streetlight. And there he saw them. A black woman in a worn coat, leaning against a brick wall. A little boy slept in her arms, his small face buried against her shoulder. The song came from her lips. Tamia Charelle. She sang softly, enough not to wake the child, yet sufficient to keep the cold at bay. Her voice didn't only cradle her son, it seemed to cradle herself. And somehow, the man standing quietly in the shadows. Gary didn't know how long he had been standing there, only that when she finally looked up, their eyes met, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Tamia studied the man before her. The light revealed his face clearly wealthy, from the shoes to the tailored coat to the posture, but his eyes were hollow. She had seen many kinds of people on the streets, those who pitied, despised, and feared, but his gaze was different. No pity, No fear, only a loneliness she recognized instantly. "You sing beautifully," Gary said, his voice hoarse from the cold and something else tightening in his chest. Tamia smiled faintly. "Music doesn't cost anything to make, but sometimes it can save a soul that's worn out." She didn't look at him, just spoke as if to herself. Gary listened but couldn't find words to answer. After a pause, he reached for his wallet, took out a few bills, and held them out. "Please take this. Buy something warm for the two of you." It was instinct reflex from a man used to fixing everything with money. But the moment she looked up, he knew he'd made a mistake. Tamia's eyes hardened from gentle to proud, cold and sharp as steel. She said quietly, "You don't have to. I'm not someone you can give charity to." Her words were soft, yet sliced through the air like a blade. Gary froze, the money still in his hand. No one had ever refused him like that. They didn't need the money, not because they never dared. "I'm sorry," Gary murmured. He tucked his wallet away, his hands trembling not from the cold but shame. He didn't understand why he suddenly felt small. Tamia stayed silent. She gently rocked the sleeping child, her voice low. "I don't sing for money. I sing so my son can believe the world still has music, even when it isn't fair." For the first time in years, Gary had no answer. He, the man who always had one, stood there, wordless. Before him was a woman who had nothing, yet possessed everything he'd lost: faith, dignity, and a reason to live. A gust of wind swept through, cutting cold. Gary took off his coat, about to drape it over her shoulders. Tamia tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening. "Thank you, but we'll be fine." He nodded, sitting slowly on the steps across from her. "Do you live here?" "Wherever there's space, I live there." Her tone was calm, neither bitter nor angry. "And you?" "I live somewhere very high." She let out a small laugh, weary yet genuine. "Too high, and it gets cold up there, doesn't it?" Gary looked up. He wanted to answer, but his throat tightened. In her eyes, he saw himself, a soul shivering in the night. The difference was that she had a reason to keep singing. He did not. Before leaving, Gary asked softly, "What's your name?" "Tamia." "Tamia, that's a beautiful name. Beauty doesn't give me a home," she said gently, "but it reminds me who I am." He smiled faintly, nodded, and turned away. Each step felt heavy, yet something inside him flickered fragile, small, but real. That night, for the first time in years, Gary couldn't sleep, not from worry, but from wanting to hear that voice again. And he didn't yet know that, in that narrow Brooklyn alley, two worlds, one from the 47th floor and one from the frozen street, had just begun to orbit each other. The next morning, the city was as noisy as ever. Early winter sunlight filtered through the thick glass of Bellamy Tower, spilling across a desk cluttered with papers, reports, and a packed meeting schedule. Gary sat there, eyes fixed on the screen, mind far away. He could still hear that voice. The song played in his head like a note that refused to fade. It wasn't a perfect voice, not polished or trained, but it had something none of the million-dollar studio recordings he owned could ever capture: truth. He tried to work, but focus eluded him. Each time he saw the words Bellamy Systems on a document, a hollowness spread through him. The world he had built, grand, logical, hierarchical, profitable, lacked a soul. Gary stood, grabbed his coat, and left without a word. His car crossed Fifth Avenue, then the Brooklyn Bridge, and stopped at the corner where he had met her the night before. No one was there. Only a few empty beer cans, a thin blanket left behind, and the wind whispering through the old bridge steps. He sat silently, staring into space, as if willing that voice to rise again. But only the distant rumble of trucks and the faint toll of church bells answered him. After a while, he crossed the street to a small cafe glowing with a flickering neon sign that read Blue Lantern Cafe. It was the place no one noticed, but the coffee smelled real. Gary sat and ordered a black coffee with no sugar. Just as he was about to leave, the door opened and she walked in. Tamia still wore the same old coat. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were bright. She ordered a cup of hot water, not coffee. When she noticed Gary, she paused, then smiled slightly. "Lost again?" she teased lightly. Gary chuckled, unsure how to respond. Maybe. But this time, I got lost on purpose. Tamia sat at the table across from him. She wasn't distant, but not friendly either, just curious, studying him, trying to figure out why this man cared. Do you always sing around here? No. Only when my son's asleep. Where is he now? At the shelter. They're watching him this morning. She said it casually, as if leaving her child at a temporary center was just another part of life. Gary felt his throat tighten. He wanted to ask more, but didn't want to rewind her. Finally, he said quietly, I still feel sorry about last night. I shouldn't have offered you money like that. Tamia sipped her hot water, smiling faintly. Don't worry. I'm used to it. Used to what? To people who think money is the answer to everything. Gary lowered his gaze. He couldn't argue, he was living proof of that truth. But you're different, she said, making him look up. Why do you think so? Because you knew you were wrong. Most people don't, or don't care. Silence settled between them. Her words pricked at him gently but deeply. Strangely, the feeling was almost comforting. To be seen through, and somehow understood. Thank you, he murmured. Don't thank me. I just told the truth. Morning light streamed through the window, soft on her face, dark eyes, sun-warmed skin, fine lines at the corners of her mouth, left by wind and time. She wasn't beautiful in a polished way, but there was something impossible to look away from the strength of someone who had survived. Have you ever thought about changing your life? He asked. You mean get a job, rent a place, live like a normal person? Something like that. What's normal, really? For me, waking up daily, keeping my heart clean, and not hurting anyone is normal enough. Gary said nothing. He watched her, a quiet mix of admiration and wonder rising inside him. She spoke no grand truths, made no accusations, but every word made him ashamed of the life he'd built. When Tamia stood to leave, Gary hurriedly reached into his coat pocket. It's not money, he said quickly. It's a card. If you ever need help with housing, call this number. I know someone who runs a shelter for single women. Tamia Post. Her expression softened. She took the card and glanced at the name Gary Bellamy. So, you're not just some lost stranger, she said. Gary smiled, a bit embarrassed. Sometimes I wish I were. Why? Because people who are lost still have hope of finding their way. I'm not sure I do. She studied him quietly, then nodded. You do. You just haven't taken the first step yet. With that, Tamia walked out. The door closed behind her, a small bell chiming in the air. Gary sat there for a long time, staring at his cold coffee, and felt something warm inside for the first time in years. The city still sparkled in his penthouse that evening, but he no longer saw it the same way. He thought of Tamia, the woman who had taught him a lesson no business school ever could, that sometimes, the poorer a thing is, the more accurate its value. He opened his laptop and scrolled through pending projects. One line caught his eye. New AI housing program. Smart homes for low-income families. He once saw it as a PR move, a marketing number on an expansion plan. But now, it looked different. For the first time, he wondered, what if I used technology to help them? The thought made his heart beat faster, not from ambition but purpose. He called his assistant. Cancel all my meetings tomorrow morning. I'm going to the shelter in Brooklyn. Yes, sir. May I ask why? Just tell them. I need to see something real. Gary drove to the temporary housing center Tamia had mentioned the next morning. He didn't announce his visit, he just walked in like anyone else. Small rooms, thin blankets, children crying, and women laughing through exhaustion. At the end of the hallway, he saw her folding clothes for the kids. Tamia looked up, surprised, but not unwelcoming. You really came. Guess I'm starting to take your advice. What advice? To take a step. Tamia smiled. Her smile was different this time, no distance, only a quiet warmth, like sunlight through a dusty window. Gary stayed all day. He talked with single mothers, volunteers, and people who had once lived on the streets. Each story was a small fragment of a world he'd never known, one held together not by power or wealth, but by kindness. That afternoon, he sat beside Tamia on the steps. Children ran around them, their laughter blending with the wind. Gary asked softly, Don't you ever get tired, living like this every day? Of course, she said. But every day I still have my voice, my son, and my faith that tomorrow will breathe easier than today. That's enough. He looked at her, feeling both calm and moved. No one had ever said something so simple, so whole. In his world, people tired themselves chasing more. She tired herself trying to have just enough. When the sun began to set, Tamia packed her things. Gary hesitated, then said, "Tamia, if I asked to see you again, would you let me?" She looked at him, golden light glinting in her eyes. "See me for what?" "To hear you sing, maybe." She smiled, gentle but proud. "I sing for life, not on request." The line caught him off guard, then made him laugh. "You always make me feel small." "I don't make you feel that way. You finally notice it." Gary nodded, smiling softly. She was right. This woman, through her simple truth, had made him face himself. For the first time in years, he wanted to prove something that had nothing to do with money. As she walked away, he called after her, "I'll find you again, Tamia." She didn't turn around. She only lifted her hand in a wave, her voice drifting back in the wind. "If you truly look, you'll find me." Gary stood in the Brooklyn sunset, his heart full of a strange, quiet feeling. Not love, not yet, but unmistakably, a beginning. New York at night was the same as always, noisy, restless, full of horns and hurried footsteps. But tonight, Gary felt the city was different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. Since meeting Tamia at the shelter, Gary had lived as if in two parallel worlds. By day, he was still the cold, calculating CEO of Bellamy Systems, making decisions, signing contracts, running an empire. But when night came, the image of that woman filled his mind. The way she had said, "I sing so my son can believe the world still has music," echoed endlessly inside him. He'd grown used to praise, luxury meetings, and billion-dollar figures. Yet one woman with no home, no fame, asking nothing from him had somehow brought him back to himself. For 3 nights, Gary couldn't sleep. He worked, met clients, smiled when required, but his heart was elsewhere. On the 4th night, he couldn't bear it anymore. 3 a.m., he drove through Brooklyn, retracing the same streets, clinging to a vague hope to hear that voice again. The city, in its late-night stillness, felt like cold metal. Streetlights flickered sparsely. The wind cut his face with its chill. But as his car passed under the bridge their place, he saw a faint light and heard a sound. Her voice. He turned off the engine and stepped out. Tamia was there, wrapped in her old coat, holding her sleeping son, singing softly. It's not the same song as before. This one is slower and sadder, but warmer, too. It was a song about the lost ones wandering through the night, souls, searching for each other in a vast world. Gary stood motionless. His eyes burned not from the wind, but from something welling up inside. He waited until she finished. "Tamia," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "You again? You've got a talent for showing up in the middle of the night." Gary stepped closer and sat down in front of her. He didn't speak immediately, just looked at the two of them. The child slept soundly, breathing softly, and his face was peaceful. "I don't know why," Gary said, "but I can't forget your voice." Tamia studied him, her eyes cautious but curious. "You've met so many people. You shouldn't let one voice haunt you this much." "It doesn't haunt me," he said. "It reminds me I'm still human." Tamia smiled faintly. "That sounds like a movie line. But it's a good one." They fell silent. The wind blew cold, yet something warm settled between them. Then Gary spoke, his voice low, as if afraid of his words. "Tamia, if I told you I wanted you to be my wife, what would you do?" She froze. For a moment, her eyes widened in disbelief. Then she laughed, an honest, startled laugh. Not mocking, just astonished. "You're joking, right?" "No. We've only met a few times. You don't even know how I live. I know enough to realize that I'm saying something true for the first time in my life." Tamia grew quiet. She placed a hand on her chest and sighed softly. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? I've slept in train stations, eaten leftover bread, and sung on the street so my son wouldn't cry. I'm not the kind of woman you bring home. Gary met her eyes. You're wrong. That's exactly why I want to bring you home. The words left her stunned. After a long pause, she said slowly, You don't have to pity me, Gary. I don't, he said. I just want to believe there's something bigger than money. And you make me believe that. She looked at him for a long time, her gaze skeptical and softening. You're crazy. Maybe. For the first time in my life, I like that feeling. Tamia chuckled. All right. Suppose I say yes, what would you do then? I'd do exactly what I said. I'd marry you, not for PR, a project or status, for nothing, except that it would make me feel alive. She tilted her head, smiling faintly, her eyes glimmering in the streetlight. Then I have one condition. What is it? If you do this, do it for real. No lies, no show, no proving a point. If you can give up everything and still choose me, I'll believe you. Gary nodded slowly. Deal accepted. Deal? She teased. Sorry. Business habit. They both laughed softly, the sound fragile but glowing in the winter night. Before she left, Gary held out his hand. Tamia looked at it for a long time. Then she placed her own hand in his. Cold. Rough. But real. Let's see how long your madness lasts, she said. You'd be surprised. Gary smiled. I always finish what I start. That night, Gary didn't go home. He drove aimlessly through streets, bridges, and neighborhoods he'd never seen. Tamia's words echoed in his mind. If you do it for real. What did real mean? For Gary, who had lived his whole life by plans and logic, it was like a new language. But for once, he didn't want to analyze it. He just wanted to feel it. He stopped by the Hudson River. The wind howled. Mist drifted over the water. He stepped out, staring at the dark surface reflecting the city lights. Somewhere inside, he knew something was beginning. Something he couldn't control and didn't want to. The next morning, Tamia received a handwritten letter. No elegant envelope, no company logo, just a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, simple. I don't know what I deserve, but you make me want to improve. If you agree, tomorrow night, I want to take you and your son somewhere. Not to impress you, to share a real meal, like two ordinary people. Gary. Tamia read it in silence. She had received many offers before, most out of pity or curiosity. But this felt different. No promises, no pressure, just a strange, quiet sincerity. That night, she went. A small black car pulled up in front of the shelter. Not a limousine. No driver. Gary sat behind the wheel himself. He stepped out and smiled. Good evening, Tamia. She held her son, hesitating as she climbed in. I still don't think this is a good idea. I know, but I don't want you to believe it's good. I want you to feel it. They stopped at a little riverside diner, where people ate burgers and pizza under the sound of soft jazz. No one recognized Gary Bellamy, the young billionaire, eating fries with a homeless woman and her 4-year-old son, and Gary had never felt so free. Tamia laughed, watching him clumsily feed the boy. You're ruining your image, you know. Images don't feed anyone, but they keep you safe. Maybe I'm tired of being safe. When they left, a light fog was settling over the city. Tamia wrapped her son's scarf. Gary watched her, a rush of tenderness and awe and fear of losing her stirring inside. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tamia turned first, smiling. If you're sincere, Gary, I don't need promises. Just don't turn me into a story to tell. Gary met her gaze, his voice low. No. I want to turn this story into my life. Tamia paused, her expression softening. She didn't say another word, just nodded. The wind swept past, cold and clean, carrying with it something both of them understood. Everything had just truly begun. That night, Gary couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the mist veil the city, remembering the feel of her hand in his. In his heart, one line repeated itself. If you do it for real. And he knew come morning, he would do the craziest thing he'd ever done in his life. Bring that woman and her child into his world. When Tamia walked hand in hand with her son into Bellamy Manor, a light rain was falling over New York. Raindrops landed on her worn coat, soaking through to her shoulders, cold and sharp. but she kept walking slowly and steadily between two rows of servants dressed in black uniforms. Gary walked beside her. His gaze was gentle, his voice low, reassuring. "It's just a house, Tamia. Don't let it make you feel small." She smiled faintly. "I'm not afraid of houses, Gary. I'm afraid of the eyes inside them." The heavy wooden doors opened to reveal a hall of blinding luxury gilded ceilings, a grand spiral staircase, old portraits watching from the walls. Standing in the center was a woman, Patricia Bellamy, Gary's mother. Her face was beautiful and refined, but her eyes were as sharp as a blade polished too long. "You're home, Gary?" "Yes, Mother." "And this is?" Gary took Tamia's hand gently. "Mother, this is Tamia, the woman I told you about." Patricia looked her over, head to toe, a gaze that weighed and measured. The old coat, the scuffed shoes, her neatly tied hair, no jewelry. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Well, interesting. My son usually has rather exquisite taste in companions." Tamia's reply was soft, like smoke. "Thank you, ma'am. I've never really thought of myself as anyone's taste." Gary stiffened, and Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. A thin, taut silence stretched between the two women for a moment, delicate as a string pulled tight. "Your room is on the second floor," Patricia said evenly. "The staff will show you. If you need anything, ask." "Thank you." Tamia inclined her head, then led her son up the stairs, straight-backed, steady, unshaken. Gary watched her go, torn between love and pride. That evening, a small dinner party was held, not officially to introduce Tamia, but everyone knew that was the actual reason. The guests were friends, partners, shareholders, the people Patricia wanted to keep inside her circle of power. Tamia sat beside Gary, silent. The room buzzed with half-joking, half-cruel remarks. "Gary, this one's unique. Where on earth did you find her? I heard you used to sing in Brooklyn. How artistic. Let me guess you're making a live documentary now." Laughter rippled through the table. Tamia didn't reply. She only smiled, faintly. She had seen those looks before. Years on the streets had taught her that silence carried strength. But when a middle-aged man said mockingly, "Do you know the rules of this crowd? Around here, everyone wears a mask." Tamia set her glass down and looked at him calmly. "Maybe that's why I never wanted to be part of it." The air froze. Patricia's brow tightened. Gary placed his hand over Tamia's, a quiet "thank you." After the party, Patricia called Gary aside. "Do you even know what you're doing? Do you think this is good for Bellamy's reputation?" "Mother, I don't need a reputation that costs me my honesty. You can't marry someone like her. She doesn't fit. She doesn't understand our world, our customs, our standards." Gary's voice was calm, but unyielding. "I don't need her to fit my world. I need her to fit me." Patricia fell silent. There was pain in her eyes, but they remained hard. "One day you'll learn, son, love isn't enough to hold an empire together." Gary smiled sadly. "Maybe. But if I must trade my soul to keep it, that empire isn't worth keeping." He walked away, leaving his mother standing in the heavy quiet of the great hall. The next day, Patricia hosted a much larger party, this time with the media invited. Friends, investors, journalists, all eager to see the woman who changed Gary Bellamy. Tamia didn't want to go. She hated crowds, hated being watched. But Gary said softly, "You don't have to prove anything. Just stand beside me." And so she agreed. The dress Gary chose for her was simple, a soft cream color, elegant and unpretentious. When she descended the staircase, the room fell silent, not because she dazzled, but because she was real. Among a sea of polished smiles and designer perfection, Tamia was something else, quiet, grounded, alive. A businesswoman approached, smiling with false warmth. "So, Tamia, what did you do before you met Gary?" Tamia smiled back. "I sang." "Oh, how lovely. Where?" "On the streets, under bridges, in places where people don't listen but need to." The woman stiffened, fumbling for a new topic. Gary, watching nearby, felt a deep swell of admiration. Later, a young reporter slipped close, a hidden mic tucked in his sleeve. "Excuse me, miss, there's a rumor you were once homeless. Any comment?" Tamia met the small lens peeking from his cuff. "Yes," she said calmly. "I once had no home, but I was never without a soul. The room went quiet. Gary squeezed her hand gently. You just left them speechless. Tamia replied softly, They don't need to be silent. They need to listen. After the guests had gone that night, they walked into the garden. Warm lamplight fell through the trees. The air smelled faintly of old rain. Tamia slipped off her heels and stepped barefoot onto the grass, breathing in. You okay? Gary asked. I am. I've faced worse stares than theirs. You don't have to face them alone. Gary, I'm not enduring them. I'm standing. There's a difference. She turned to him. You know, there are two kinds of people in this world, those who fear losing and have nothing left to lose. I'm the second kind. That's why I'm free. Gary said nothing. Her words hit him like cold water, painful, but waking. He took her hand. Then let me be free with you. Tamia looked at him. She didn't answer, but her eyes did. The next morning, the New York Chronicle headline screamed, Gary Bellamy and the Mysterious Woman, a love across class lines. Beneath a photo of them holding hands were hundreds of comments. PR stunt. She's playing the sympathy card. Unbelievable. Gary read every word, then tossed his phone onto the table. Tamia came up beside him. Are you angry they're talking about me like that? I'm angry they don't understand you. She smiled gently. They don't have to. As long as you believe me. I do, he said quietly. And from that moment, Gary knew there was no turning back. This love would have to weather storms, walk through fire, and stand against eyes as sharp as knives, to prove one thing: a woman's dignity could be stronger than the reputation of an empire. It rained for 3 days straight. Bellamy Manor lay beneath a curtain of mist. Tamia sat by the window on the second floor, watching raindrops slide down the glass, her heart as still as a lake. Since the party, the media hadn't stopped talking about her. From homeless woman to billionaire's lover, who is the woman who's driven Gary Bellamy mad? Articles, old photos, rumors poured out endlessly, yet strangely, Tamia wasn't afraid. What unsettled her more was Patricia's eyes, the mix of pity and warning behind them. During those rainy days, Gary hardly left home. He cancelled meetings, choosing instead to spend time with Tamia and Ethan, her son. Mornings made coffee and read in the study. Afternoons, he played with Ethan in the hallway. To Tamia, it all felt strange but soothing. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Tamia entered the library where Gary had been reading. The air was heavy with the scent of wood and black tea. He looked up and smiled gently. Still not used to the house? Something like that, she said, sitting opposite him, wrapping her hands around a warm cup. It's too quiet. So quiet it's almost frightening. Gary nodded. I've lived in this silence for 10 years. At first, it felt peaceful. Then I realized it was punishment. Punishment for what? She asked softly. For becoming the man my mother wanted me to be. No freedom, no feeling. Just a perfect version of myself for others to admire. He gave a tired laugh. I used to think emotions were a luxury. Until I met you. Tamia lifted her head, surprised. You think I taught you how to feel? No. You reminded me that feelings still exist. A silence fell between them. Rain tapped gently at the glass. Tamia set down her cup. Gary, do you ever feel afraid? Afraid of what? Of happiness? He paused, then nodded. Yes, because I don't know how to keep it. Everything I've ever had was bought, and anything can be lost. Tamia smiled sadly. I understand that. You do? I once had everything: big house, powerful parents, servants attending every meal. But I left, because in that house, affection was traded for reputation. I was terrified of living in a world where no one dared to be real. Gary looked up. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. They both understood they weren't two people from different classes, but two lost souls once swallowed by their worlds. Tamia. If you could choose again, would you still take this path? She thought for a moment, then smiled. Yes, because this path led me to someone like you. Gary froze. For the first time, he couldn't speak. He only felt his heart pounding as if the cold stone walls around it had begun to crack. Late that night, the house was quiet. Tamia walked down the long corridor and stopped at the library door. The light was still on. Gary sat slumped at the desk, a book fallen to the floor. She stepped closer and draped a blanket over his shoulders. In that moment, she saw the truth the man the world admired was, deep down, a child who had never been allowed to be tired. She watched him for a long while, whispering, almost to herself, maybe everyone needs to be loved in a way they don't yet know they need. The next morning, Gary rose earlier than usual. He entered the garden and saw Tamia sitting under a tree with Ethan. Sunlight glowed through her hair like gold threads. The sight was so peaceful, he wished time would stop. He walked over. "How's the morning?" "Warm enough to believe today will be kind," she said. They had breakfast together, talking easily. Gary told her about his childhood. His mother only allowed him to smile for magazine photos. Tamia spoke of the day she ran away from home, carrying only a small silver pendant, the last piece of her old life. There were no roles between them, no billionaire, no homeless woman, just two people, sitting together, sharing what they once hid. That afternoon, Tamia entered Gary's office. On the desk were blueprints and files labeled Bellamy Human Program, a housing initiative for people experiencing homelessness. She looked at him in surprise. "You're really doing this?" "Yes," he said. "I want to use what I've built to create homes not for the brand, but for real people." Tamia smiled softly. "That's the first time I've seen you talk about work with that kind of light in your eyes. Maybe because it finally feels meaningful." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "Gary, aren't you afraid people will say you're only doing this because of me?" "I'm only afraid of one thing." "What's that?" "That without you, I'll forget I ever had a heart." They stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath. Neither spoke. Only the wind whispered outside as their hands brushed, trembling. Real. Tamia closed her eyes, half from fear, half from wanting to hold on to the moment forever. That evening, Gary carried Ethan to bed. Tamia stood at the doorway, watching him gently tuck in the boy and tell a story until he fell asleep. She had always believed she would have to face the world alone. But now, for the first time, someone was standing beside her. When Gary turned around, she said quietly, "You know, I used to be afraid of loving someone." "Why?" "Because love made me weak. I had to be strong so my son could stand. But now, I'm not afraid anymore." Gary smiled softly. "Maybe you've realized that love doesn't make us weak. It makes us strong enough to face what we were running from." She laughed, tears glimmering in her eyes. "You always sound like you're reading from a book." "That's because you make me want to tell the truth." Tamia leaned her head on his shoulder. The peace in that moment felt unfamiliar but sweet. Gary looked out the window. The rain had stopped. He whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "Maybe the walls are finally coming down." Tamia said nothing, only smiled. Her eyes were damp and shining, reflecting the first light of dawn for two souls who had wandered apart for far too long. March. New York was softening into spring. The snow had melted from the sidewalks, and the wind carried a faint scent of warmth. But in the glasshouse behind Bellamy Manor, the roses had yet to bloom. Tamia stood among the wilted plants, her fingers brushing a dying petal. Gary approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I remember you like it here," he said, setting one down on the wooden table. Tamia smiled faintly, though something heavy lingered behind her eyes. "Maybe because here, even dead flowers are kept. People don't throw them away, they wait to see if they can live again." Gary looked at her, voice quiet. "Are you talking about the flowers? Or yourself?" Tamia didn't answer at first. After a moment, she placed her cup down, her voice low. "Gary, there's something I've never told you." She turned to him, her eyes deep and tired, carrying the remnants of winter. "Do you know why I can stand tall when people look down on me?" Gary shook his head. "Because I've already faced worse looks ones from my own family." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Tamia exhaled slowly. "I wasn't born on the streets, Gary. I was born in a house bigger than this one in Boston. My parents own Wells Textiles. I grew up surrounded by silk and banquets, but never affection." She gave a bitter smile. "They taught me that women are meant to be ornaments chosen, placed, displayed. And when I fell in love with someone they disapproved of, they called it betrayal." Gary stayed silent. Her voice trembled, but her words stayed steady. "I loved a man who worked for my father, poor but honest. I thought he was everything. I left my home, money, and name to be with him, And when everything fell apart, he left. No goodbye. She laughed softly, a fragile, cracked sound. I was pregnant with Ethan then. I didn't go back. I knew if I did, they'd make me get rid of the baby. They called me a disgrace. So I chose the only path left to disappear. No one looked, no one asked. Gary's chest tightened. He stepped closer, but she raised a hand to stop him. Don't pity me, Gary. I don't want pity. I need you to understand. The woman standing before you isn't just someone who used to sing under bridges. I once had everything, lost it all, and still chose to live honestly. Gary's voice was barely a whisper. Tamia, I've never admired anyone the way I admire you. She let out a small laugh, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. Admire? Gary, you're a millionaire. You don't need to admire someone who's eaten leftovers. No, you're wrong, he said quietly. I have money. But you have something I've spent my whole life trying to find: freedom. Tamia looked at him for a long moment. In the dim light of the greenhouse, she looked like a painting come to life, fragile and fierce at once. Do you know what the hardest part was? She whispered. It was realizing that I still didn't hate anyone after losing everything. I just felt light, like I was finally done being controlled. Gary stepped closer, gently taking her hand. And now, you have me. Not to control you, to stand beside you. Tamia bit her lip, lowered her head, and slipped a tear onto his hand. She said nothing. But in that silence, something unspoken was shared, an old wound quietly touched, not to heal it, but to carry it together. The next morning, the sky cleared. Tamia took Ethan to the park. He ran and laughed, and she watched him, peace softening her face, a feeling she hadn't known in years. But peace never lasts long. That afternoon, Gary received a call from his attorney, Jonathan Myers. Gary, you need to hear this. The Herald Tribune just got a tip. Tamia Charelle is Tamia Wells, daughter of the Wells Textile Group in Boston. Gary froze. Where did it come from? Seems to be from her own family. They said they wanted to warn you before it hits the press. Gary closed his eyes. A chill crept through him, not anger, just sorrow. He knew what was coming and how cruel it would be. That evening, he found Tamia reading to Ethan, her voice soft under the warm glow of a lamp. When she looked up, she saw the truth in his eyes immediately. Gary, what happened? He sat beside her, quiet for a long moment. They know, Tamia, about your past. It'll be everywhere by morning. She didn't flinch, only nodded slowly. I knew this day would come. You're not afraid? No, I've already lost everything once. There's nothing left to fear. Gary took her hand. We'll face it together. Tamia shook her head gently. No, Gary. Don't let my story destroy yours. Tamia, you don't understand. Your world isn't like mine. Once the media smells blood, they'll tear everything apart. I won't let you lose what you've built. Gary met her gaze, steady. If what I've built can be destroyed just because people don't understand, it's not worth saving. She laughed through her tears. You really are the craziest man I've ever met. I'm only crazy when I'm in love. That night, Tamia sat alone by the window. She thought of Boston, the house that once held her captive, her mother teaching her how to bow, and her father saying, "A Wells girl never cries in public." And now, her tears fell freely, not from fear, but from freedom. Gary entered quietly, draping a coat over her shoulders. He didn't speak. He sat beside her, watching the sleeping city. After a while, Tamia whispered, "You're not angry that I hid it from you?" "No. I'm angry that you thought you had to. You never needed to make yourself smaller to fit beside me. I want you exactly as you are, no matter how many layers your past has." Tamia nodded, her lips trembling. "Thank you, Gary. You don't need to thank me. Just don't run again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I ran from everything once," she murmured. "But this time, I'll stay." Outside, the city lights flickered. Somewhere, a newspaper front page was being printed for the morning. But in that quiet room, between two people who had already lost everything, there was no more fear, only truth, and a love strong enough to stand with it. That morning, New York awoke to a headline stretched across the front page of the Herald Tribune. Tamia Wells, the runaway heiress turned homeless bride of tech billionaire Gary Bellamy. A half-page photo showed Tamia stepping out of Gary's car in her simple dress, eyes calm amid a sea of cameras. But the subheadings were knives. A calculated romance or a manufactured fairy tale. From Boston's red carpets to city sidewalks, and now, $1 million silver ring. The city buzzed. Social media exploded. Old photos of her resurfaced. A teenage girl in white silk, lips painted red, proud and poised, juxtaposed against an image of her cradling her son under a bridge. The comments were vicious. She's obviously manipulating him. If she were genuine, she wouldn't have hidden it. He's been fooled. Gary sat in his office, reading every line. He wasn't angry, just heavy-hearted. People would always rather judge than understand. When Tamia entered, he closed the laptop. "You've seen it?" "Yes." She poured herself a glass of water and drank slowly, her voice steady. "They have the right to speak. I have the right not to fall." Gary watched her. "We can lie low for a while. I'll have the PR team manage the headlines. You don't need to face them." Tamia shook her head. "No, Gary. If I hide, they'll believe the story they wrote. I won't live a life other people narrate for me." He looked into her eyes deep, composed, quietly defiant, and he understood he couldn't stop her. She had faced hunger and cold and the endless silence of the streets. A newspaper couldn't scare her. Tamia moved to the window, looking out at the restless city. "You know, Gary," she said softly, "I used to think silence was the safest place to live. But now I know silence helps lies grow. I won't be silent anymore." He asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" She turned, her eyes sharp and clear as a blade. "Stand up, speak, and make them hear my real voice." That afternoon, Tamia reached out to an NBC journalist, the same one who had once interviewed her for a community program years before. Gary watched her organize her notes, every word precise, not like someone afraid of being judged, but like someone preparing for battle. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "Once you go public, there's no going back." She smiled. "I've had nothing to go back to before. Now, at least I have you." Gary took her hand. "Then I'll be right beside you." The NBC conference room blazed with lights. Dozens of reporters crowded in, microphones aimed at the stage. News of Tamia Charelle Bellamy's appearance, her new married name, had spread across every major network in hours. When she walked in with Gary, the room fell into a hush. No glittering gown, no diamonds, just a white blouse, black trousers, hair neatly tied. Standing beneath the lights, she radiated a quiet strength, the beauty of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, only to tell the truth. The host spoke first. "Mrs. Bellamy, some reports claim you hid your identity to stage an emotional story for attention. Would you like to respond?" Tamia nodded. Her voice was low, steady, resonant, and as she spoke, the room went still. "I didn't hide my past to deceive anyone. I hid to find myself. When born into a family where reputation matters more than breath, you learn to live without air. I left not because I wanted to, but because I needed to be real, to breathe without money telling me how." Another reporter called out, "So you admit you were the Wells heiress?" "Yes." "And you lived homeless for 5 years?" "Yes. But I don't see that as shame. It was the education that taught me what people truly are." Fingers paused over keyboards. She went on, her gaze meeting the cameras. "I know some will laugh, some will doubt, but I don't need their belief. All I need is for the little girl I once was to lift her head and say, 'We lived truthfully.' And as for Gary Bellamy," she turned to him. Gary met her eyes filled with pride. Tamia spoke softly, each word clear. "He didn't save me. He saw me when the world refused to look. And sometimes, having one person truly see you is enough to keep you alive." The room was silent. A few reporters lowered their eyes. Under the table, Gary squeezed her hand. The host turned to him. "Mr. Bellamy, would you like to add anything?" Gary rose, calm, voice resonant. "I once believed love was a transaction, something measured in value. But Tamia taught me that the rarest thing in the world is truth. I'm proud to be her husband. And if this love costs me contracts or investors, so be it. Because she gave me what no money ever could, my heart." His words filled the room like light breaking through glass. Cameras flashed wildly. No one had ever heard the cold, untouchable tech billionaire speak with such quiet simplicity. After the interview, the media's tone shifted. Cruel headlines gave way to admiration. True Love is Real and Tamia Bellamy trended worldwide within 24 hours. Major outlets wrote, "A woman who left wealth to find herself and found love along the way." At Bellamy Manor, Patricia watched the broadcast from her private room. When she heard her son say, "I'm proud to be her husband," her eyes filled. For the first time, she realized she had been wrong. Tamia hadn't threatened her son's empire, she had restored his humanity. That night, Gary and Tamia sat on the floor of their room overlooking the Hudson River. Neither spoke for a while. They just listened to the wind against the glass. Tamia rested her head on his shoulder. "Today, I didn't speak to be forgiven," she said softly. "I spoke to feel light again." "I know," Gary whispered, "and you made the whole world listen." She smiled. "I don't need them quiet. I need them to hear." "I heard you," he said. "That's enough." She looked up at him, her eyes bright after the storm. "What do we do now?" Gary smiled. "Now, we stop running. We live as two people who truly chose each other." Outside, the city still burned with light. But in that room by the river, there were two other lights, warm, steady, and honest. The light of two hearts that had dared to stand together in the storm. A late afternoon in May. Soft golden sunlight drifted through the garden of Bellamy Manor, carrying the scent of mock orange blossoms. Tamia was watering the plants when a black car stopped at the gate. The man who stepped out was Jonathan Myers, the Bellamy family's longtime attorney, who had worked for Gary's grandfather for over 30 years. He strolled, leaning on his cane, his smile warm. "Gary, forgive me for arriving unannounced," he said. "There's something I must deliver." Gary and Tamia led him into the sitting room. Jonathan opened a worn leather briefcase and took out a small oak box, engraved with the initials A.B. Arthur Bellamy. The seal was old but unbroken. "He asked me," Jonathan said, voice deliberate, "that if, by the age of 35, you had found a true reason to marry, I was to give this to you." Gary froze. "A reason to marry," he repeated softly, glancing at Tamia. She squeezed his hand and nodded. "Open it." The latch clicked. Inside were a handwritten letter and a slim, leather-bound journal. Gary opened the letter carefully. The handwriting, bold, slightly slanted, was unmistakably his grandfather's. "Gary, if you are reading this, I am likely no longer here. But I know you now stand at the same crossroad every Bellamy man has faced between money and heart. I watched your father lose himself to the fear of feeling, and I feared you would repeat his mistake. So I created a false condition. You must marry before 35 to keep your inheritance. It was never true. It was only meant to force you to answer the question I truly cared about. Who would you choose if money were no longer a chain?" Gary's eyes blurred. Tamia said nothing. She just laid her hand gently on his shoulder. He read on, his voice thick. "If you've reached this part, I trust you've already chosen. And if the one you love comes from a world unlike ours, know this, she might be the only one strong enough to help you see yourself clearly. Gary, real love isn't something preserved by rules or conditions. It's the hardest lesson our family has always avoided. Now, I believe you've finally learned it." The room went silent. Jonathan's eyes glistened behind his glasses. "Arthur always believed you'd be different," he said quietly. "And now, I see he was right." Gary nodded, voice unsteady. "All his life, he tried to teach me freedom, and I mistook it for power. I finally understand that true freedom is to love without fear of loss." Tamia's hand tightened around his. She saw something rare in his eyes, not pain, but release. The man who once controlled everything was finally letting himself feel. Jonathan smiled. "There's one more thing in the box. Your grandfather said to look at it last." Gary reached in. At the bottom lay an old photograph, Arthur Bellamy, smiling, beside a radiant black woman. On the back, written in fading ink, "Evelyn, the woman who taught me that hearts have no color." Tamia lifted a hand to her lips. Stunned, Gary stared in silence. Jonathan spoke softly. "You probably never knew. Your grandfather once loved a black woman. At that time, it was forbidden. He didn't marry her, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. Perhaps that's why he believed that only when you dared to love beyond judgment would you truly live. The room was utterly still. Tamia's tears fell silently. Gary clasped her hand and whispered, "He survived in me." Later that afternoon, they went to the Hudson River. The wind carried the briny scent of water and Sunday. Gary held the letter in his palm, reading it one last time, then looked up and smiled faintly. "You were right, Tamia. I didn't choose you because I had to. I chose you because I couldn't not." Tamia's eyes shimmered in the light. "Maybe our love didn't begin with luck," she said, "but it's ending with faith." He brushed his fingers along her cheek, and with freedom, she nodded, smiling through her tears. "Your grandfather didn't just teach you, Gary. He taught me too that love must be believed in, even when no one else believes." Her hair lifted in the wind. Gary whispered, his voice like a vow, "From today on, we don't owe the world proof of anything. We live as he once wished to." The sunset burned the sky gold and crimson. In that moment, the past, judgment, and noise all dissolved into nothing. Only two people remained, hand in hand, their love unbound at last. That night, as the city glittered beyond the windows, Gary sat alone in his study. Beside him lay his grandfather's journal. He opened it carefully, reading the first entry, the 12th of August 1978. "I let Evelyn go. I told her reputation mattered more than love. Years later, I realized that reputation is a tomb for the heart. I leave behind an empire, but I pray one of my descendants will live differently." Gary closed the book, throat tight. He remembered his mother's constant refrain about image, legacy, restraint, and finally saw where that coldness began. Fear of rejection, fear of losing approval. The door opened quietly. Tamia entered, wearing a light robe, her hair loose, her eyes soft. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No," she said, sitting beside him. "I was thinking about your grandfather." She touched the journal. "He must have been so lonely writing those words." "Yes," Gary murmured, "but maybe he didn't die with regret. He left a second chance for us." Tamia took his hand. "Gary, do you ever think, maybe one day, we'll be the grandparents who leave behind a story someone can believe in?" He smiled faintly. "Yes. But that story won't begin with a condition. It'll begin with faith." She rested her head on his shoulder. Outside, New York's lights glowed like a river of stars. And for the first time, Tamia felt every lost year of her life find its resting place. Gary whispered, "He once wrote that love needs no law to hold it. I think he'd smile if he saw us now." Tamia's voice was a soft laugh against his chest. "And if he were still alive, I'd thank him for teaching you how to love a woman like me." The room glowed in the gentle amber of a single lamp. On the desk, the letter from Arthur lay open. A breeze turned the last page, revealing one final line. "If you've read this far, know that you do not inherit the Bellamy fortune. You inherit my heart." Gary stared at the words, smiling through tears. Tamia took his hand, holding it tightly. Neither spoke. Only silence filled the room, complete, peaceful, and full, like a blessing sent from the past to the two hearts who finally understood it. Morning light slipped through the curtains, soft, golden, gentle as breath. Tamia woke in a room bathed in sunlight, listening to Ethan's laughter in the garden, Gary's voice joining in. It was such a beautiful sound that she placed her hand over her heart, feeling it beat peaceful and afraid. Yes, afraid. Not of Gary, but of happiness itself, the one thing she'd never believed she had the right to keep for long. 5 years on the streets had taught Tamia that everything beautiful was fragile. A dry place to sleep could vanish after one rain. A kind person could turn cold after one rumor, and love was the most dangerous thing to believe in. Now, when everything was finally safe, when Gary and she were celebrated by the city, when the headlines had stopped, Tamia still felt her heart tighten every time he laughed, because she was terrified that if one day he changed his mind, she wouldn't survive losing him. She began waking early, cleaning, cooking, doing anything to stay busy, as if she had to earn what she'd already been given. But the more she did, the emptier she felt. Gary noticed. He didn't speak of it at first. He watched. While she was arranging flowers in the living room one afternoon, he came over. "You still haven't made peace with peace, Have you? Tamia smiled faintly. Sometimes. I don't know what to do with it. He paused, then said softly, You don't have to do anything to keep it, Tamia. Peace doesn't need to be proved. It only needs to be lived. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. You don't understand, Gary. I used to live every day afraid of being thrown out, of losing my son, of not being anyone. Now that I have everything, I'm even more afraid to lose it. You're afraid I'll leave? Tamia stayed silent, and that silence said enough. He stepped closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. Tamia, listen to me. I didn't come into your life to save you. I came because you taught me how to love again, and that love isn't going anywhere. Her eyes filled before she could stop the tears. But what if one day you get tired? What if the world starts saying I'm not good enough for you again? Gary smiled gently, wiping the tears from her cheeks. The world says a lot of things, but only two people know the truth, me and you. I chose you, and every morning I wake up, I'll keep choosing you. Tamia broke down, arms wrapping around him. For the first time, her tears weren't born of fear but comfort. Gary took her to Hudson Riverside Garden that evening, where he'd first proposed. The air was warm, sunlight rippling across the river. He spread a blanket, set down a picnic basket, and smiled. I once swore I'd never plan another fancy dinner. I'm keeping that promise. Tamia laughed softly, her eyes still damp. You always do something strange exactly when I need it. Because I follow your heart, he said, even when you're quiet. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Silence. Wind brushed the grass. The river breathed below them. Gary spoke, voice low and sure. Tamia, I don't know what the future will be, but if you ever forget who you are, remember this. I don't love you for your past or for your strength. I love you because I remember who I am when I look at you. She lifted her gaze, eyes searching his. Then she whispered, a confession she had carried for years. Gary, I'm scared. Scared that if you ever saw all the dark corners in me, you'd leave. Scared that if I'm no longer beautiful or brave one day, you'll stop seeing me the way you do now. He shook his head, smiling tenderly. Tamia, you don't have to be perfect to be loved. I love you because you're not. Every scar you carry tells a story I want to memorize. She laughed through her tears. You sound like a poet. No, he murmured. Just a man who forgot how to feel until you taught him again. Tamia pressed her forehead against his, whispering, Then if one day I forget how to love, teach me again. He held her close, replying softly, I will until we're old, or until you're tired of hearing it. The breeze stirred petals around them, and in that moment, there was no money, no fame, no past. Only two souls who had once been afraid are now brave enough to believe. That night, under a spill of moonlight, Tamia sat at her desk and began writing a letter. Not to anyone, just to herself, the girl who once sang under the Brooklyn Bridge, holding her sleeping child, thinking, I've disappeared from the world. She wrote, Tamia, if you're reading this, it means you're still alive and loved. Someone sees you not because you're strong, but because you're real. You don't have to keep fighting to prove your worth. Just smile and believe. Peace isn't a luxury. It's a reward for those who never gave up. She folded the letter and tucked it inside her journal beside an old photo of her mother. Something inside her quietly healed. Gary entered with 2 mugs of cocoa. What are you writing? A letter to my past. Did she answer? Tamia smiled. She said, Thank you for surviving. He sat beside her and handed her a mug. You know, he said slowly, I used to think success meant not being afraid anymore. But now I think real success is being afraid and loving anyway. Tamia looked at him, smiling through the warmth, and believing again, even after being broken. They both laughed soft, light, as if something heavy had finally lifted. Before bed, Gary turned to her. I thought of something I want to do for you. Tamia tilted her head. What is it? I want to remake our wedding ring. Not in gold or diamonds. I want to use the little cord you wore for 5 years on the street. I'll have it shaped into a ring, because to me, that's real wealth. She stared at him, eyes shining like candlelight. You're insane, Gary Bellamy. Maybe, he grinned, but the good kind. She laughed again, tears slipping down this time, the purest kind of joy. Outside, their laughter floated through the open windows, carried by the wind. And out there, the city still glowed in 1,000 lights. But for them, there was only one light that mattered, the light of faith, restored. June arrived, and the New York sky was impossibly blue. Spring had passed like a dream, leaving behind trees bursting with life, mornings filled with golden light through the windows, and a child's laughter echoing across the garden. Gary and Tamia's life had quietly settled into a gentle rhythm, no more storms, just the calm breath of ordinary, peaceful days. One morning, Gary said, "I have a gift for you." Tamia tilted her head, smiling. "When you give gifts, it usually means trouble." "No trouble," he said, grinning. "Just a promise I finally get to keep." He took her hand and led her to the old car, the same one they had driven on their first night to Brooklyn. No driver, no guards, no noisy. Just the two of them, and the summer wind streaming through the open window. "Where are we going?" "To where it all began." They stopped beneath the Brooklyn Heights Bridge, the place where Tamia once sang at night, where Gary had stood in the cold watching her, and for the first time in his life, felt his heart remember how to beat. The scene hadn't changed much. The brick walls were still stained, the graffiti faded, the river whispering against the bridge's pillars. But now, instead of icy wind, there was sunlight. Instead of silence, the laughter of children playing somewhere nearby. Tamia stood still. "You still remember this place?" "I remember everything," Gary said softly. He took a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. She opened it. Inside was a thin silver ring, simple but glowing with its quiet light. No diamond, no brand, just one small engraving inside. "Still here." Tamia's eyes widened. "This is my old cord?" Gary nodded. "I took it to a jeweler. They said the metal wasn't precious, but it was strong. I told them not to polish out the scratches. Every mark," I said, "is a day you survived." Her hands trembled as she looked at it. Gary's voice lowered, calm and steady, as if speaking a vow. "I used to think love meant making someone happy, but now I know real love is having the courage to walk with them through the days that aren't." She didn't answer. She just leaned her forehead against his shoulder. Her tears fell onto his shirt, warm, quiet, human. Gary took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. "Tamia Charelle Bellamy," he whispered. "Will you live with me as two ordinary people until our hair turns grey, or until the wind stops blowing?" Tamia laughed softly, her voice trembling. "Gary Bellamy, you know. I said yes the night you stood in the rain, not knowing what to say." They held each other close. Above them, sunlight broke through the bridge beams, scattering into golden shards. The breeze carried the scent of salt, grass, and something unspoken, something real. Later, they sat by the Hudson River, watching the light ripple over the water. Ethan ran around them, laughing. Tamia asked, "Do you ever wonder, if you hadn't gotten lost in Brooklyn that night, would we have met?" Gary smiled. "Maybe I'd have gotten lost somewhere else. Sometimes God makes us lose our way to find the right person." Tamia laughed, tears welling again this time, the peaceful kind. 2 weeks later, they held a small wedding. No press, no luxury, no stage lights. Just a few who truly belonged. Jonathan, the family lawyer. Patricia, the mother who had finally stopped being afraid. A few friends from the Brooklyn shelter. The ceremony occurred at Hudson Riverside Garden, where Gary once said, "If you do something, make it real." The afternoon sun spread like honey. Lavender swayed gently by the river. Tamia wore a simple white dress, no train, no crown. Gary wore a light grey suit with a small flower she had picked herself. Before the vows, Patricia laid her hand on her son's shoulder and said quietly, "You chose a different path than mine, Gary. But maybe you're the one who's kept the true legacy of this family." Gary smiled and squeezed her hand. There was a peace in his eyes she had never seen before. The officiant turned to Gary. "Do you, Gary Bellamy, take Tamia Charelle Bellamy to love and cherish, in joy and sorrow, in wealth and in want, for all your days?" Gary looked into Tamia's eyes and said, "I do, because she taught me to believe in what can't be bought." Then, turning to Tamia, "And do you, Tamia Charelle Bellamy, take Gary Bellamy as your husband?" She smiled, sunlight glinting in her tears. I do. Because he gave me something I thought I'd never have again, faith. A breeze swept through when Gary slipped the silver ring onto her hand. The ring caught the light, reflecting the Hudson behind them, simple, but more beautiful than any diamond. Jonathan, the witness, smiled and whispered, Arthur Bellamy, if you're watching, I think you're smiling too. That night, after the ceremony, they walked by the river. No limousines, no fireworks, just water, wind, and the distant glow of the city. Gary held her hand. You know, he said softly, I've learned something through all this. What's that? Sometimes, you don't need to walk toward the light to find love. You must be brave enough to step into someone's darkness and stay. Tamia stopped, looking up at him. Thank you for staying, Gary. He kissed her forehead and whispered, Thank you for giving me a real home. Across the river, Manhattan shimmered. Ethan slept in Tamia's arms. Gary draped his coat around them both. They sat quietly, listening to the rhythm of the water. No more words were needed. Only silence, full, warm, complete, the only answer life ever honestly asks for. And if anyone happened to walk by and see them sitting there in the fading light, they might think, some loves don't need to be loud to be remembered. They need to be real and to last.